Thank you, Jim, very much. It's good to be here tonight. My name is Wayne Barnes, and I'm going to speak about interviewing the way the FBI does it. I was a special agent in the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 29 years. And let me put it up front that I'm not in the FBI anymore. I'm not their spokesman. I'm not speaking on their behalf tonight or putting words in their mouth. I spent 17 of those years in Washington, D.C. catching spies. It's actually a lot more exciting than it sounds. In 1986, I was named as the security officer in the Washington office. And there were 700 agents and another 1,400 support personnel, so that was a very important position. It took a lot of responsibility. But one thing I did was give security briefings to new incoming employees. It's very simple. You picture the submarine. They've got compartments in it. You don't want water leaking from one to the next. Same way with top secret clearances. You don't want information going out or even out of the organization. The first man who came in was from Afghanistan. He spoke Pashto, and he needed a security clearance. But as it turns out, his file showed he'd been employed by the FBI for 2 years before that, and then he resigned and came back 11 months later to get his clearance again. Well, he already knew the submarine story, so what was I going to say to him? So I decided that in those 11 months, I would cover whatever material I could, whatever he'd done. So I asked about that period of time. I said, where have you been? What have you done? He said, I've been around. I said, have you traveled some? He said, oh, yes, I did. He said, I went to a bar and I met a couple. They were going to get married, have their wedding in an island in the Caribbean. We got along so well, they invited me to come along. And they paid for me. I thought, where do you meet people like this? So I asked him what their names were, and he said he couldn't remember. I asked what island he went to, and he couldn't remember. For those of you who've been to an island in the Caribbean, you probably remember where you went. I went back to the money idea. I said, you haven't worked since you left the Bureau, it seems. What did you use for money? And he said, I had money. I said, how much money? He said, I just had enough. So I said, well, you did have a small pile of money. And he said, yes, I did. I said, well, where did you keep it? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, here are some options. In your mattress, under a rock, in a bank. He said, oh, in a bank. I said, what bank was that? He said, I can't remember. So he was getting upset with me because I wasn't asking him questions he could answer, but he was doing what we call frustrating the interview process. I decided to take a different direction if I could. I looked through the file, and I saw that his birthday was coming up in just a couple of weeks, and this was in mid-December. So I asked if he had plans, and he asked why I would ask that. I said, well, it's coming up. And he said, no, my birthday's in July. Well, in the FBI, when you do a background investigation, your name and your date of birth, they're everything. So it means everything we had in the file was invalid. So that was a problem. So I said, gee, how is it you didn't write down your own date of birth? And he said, well, when I came to America, I wanted a date I would never forget for my birthday, so I picked New Year's Eve. I said, you know, for most people, the day they were born is a day they'll never forget. He said, well, the calendars are all different. The Muslim calendar, the one you use here. And I said, yeah, it's off by 579 years. But the days are all the same. I told him he couldn't get his clearance at this point. I would write it up and send it to headquarters. They came back and they said, have him polygraphed. So a couple of days later, he came in. 20 minutes in, his tall tales were falling apart. The actual story was this. When he left the FBI, he went to visit his parents in Afghanistan. Then he went to visit friends in Tehran. There in a booth, in what would be like a bar, but without the alcohol, he was explaining how he had been in the FBI. The three fellows in the booth beside him were officers from Iranian intelligence, and they invited him to come back to their headquarters, not an invitation you can easily refuse. So he went back with them, and for 2 weeks they debriefed him on what he had done in the FBI, which was very upsetting to me. And they did what we call turn him around. That is, they said, go back to America, get your job back at the FBI, so you can be our spy in the FBI. So he would have been the very first penetration by the Mujahideen of US intelligence. But it didn't happen. And this was in 1986, which was, I think, 15 years before 9/11. Several interviews went by which were clean as a whistle, and then another fellow came in, an American, had been an exchange student in Poland. He was at the University of Krakow. That year was important to me for the interview. He was coming to get a job in the FBI, but he could have gotten a job at the State Department on the Polish desk or with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff. So I said, tell me a narrative about this procedure. And he said every Friday afternoon I would sign it at a certain desk. In the second week there was a lovely young lady behind the desk. I thought she was nice. I asked her out. We had many dates. We went out drinking. We drank heavily. We had sex. We had wild sex. 6 months in, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. I asked about the family. She said, well, he said, her father is a self-made man, an industrialist, and he owns a factory in the suburbs. Fine. I asked if he'd seen the factory and what it made, and he didn't have any idea. On the way back from Poland, he got home on time, but she took another 4 months to arrive. He said there was red tape and problems with paperwork. In the 6 months since he'd been back in the U.S., he said that she had changed significantly, and he was willing to admit it, but he was very sad about it. He said she hadn't had any alcohol since she'd arrived. And worse still, they hadn't had any sex in 6 months. And that was different for him. So I decided it was time to lower the boom on this young fellow. And I said, well, here's what I think. I think when they saw you sign in the first day, they realized you were a target of opportunity. They took one of the young officers or intelligence agents from Polish intelligence and put her at the desk so they could have you wine and dine her, which worked very well. Enticements with sex and with booze, being with her all the time was very important. I said, I think that the father doesn't have a factory. This is communism, the Cold War. The government owns the means of production. There is no such thing as a self-made man in Krakow. I said, that was just baloney to please you. I said, the KGB and Polish intelligence runs a quick and dirty school for 3 months for those who haven't attended the long months of intelligence school so that they could train someone for the tradecraft of espionage. Knowing she would come back and possibly be married to an FBI agent, that would be a big deal for them. And about the drinking, I said, I don't think she wanted to get drunk and be caught in her duplicity because she was inebriated. And about not getting pregnant, I said, I don't think that it was a problem with sex, but because you were, to her, an intelligence target and not really her husband, she didn't want to have sex with you and have your baby. This was a crushing blow. And you would think, was it so? So I said, here's a set of questions. When you go home tonight, have a conversation over dinner and get back to me. So the next morning he called. I answered the phone. It was first silent, and then there was sobbing. And then he said words which are etched in my soul. He said, Agent Barnes, I'm married to a Polish spy. Okay, so those 2 interviews were very significant. Through the next set of interviews, we found there were 2 more bad ones in that same category. So headquarters decided this should be a program, and they sent out those 4 first write-ups to all the security officers in the FBI around the country, saying, read these, learn from these, and do this kind of an interview. They named the program the Personnel Security Interview. Later, they just called it the PSI. So the program worked this way. You live your life a day at a time. You see it a snapshot at a time. You can refer back to when you bought your prom dress, or when you were initiated into a fraternity, or when you hit your first home run. But that's how you remember it, because that's the way our minds work. What I needed to do was do it in a linear fashion. And linear means I need to take a piece of paper and line it up like on the wall and start with the categories over here. You take family in your youth, family as a teenager, family when you're in your 20s. There's brother Joe, younger sister Susie, and then your parents. There are friends you meet along the way in Boy Scouts and sororities and fraternities. People you have as friends for a long time, other friends that you pick up along the way. What's the relationship with them, and what do you know about them? How do you interact with them? What's significant to know is that people will often say that the devil is in the details, but the devil's not in the details. It's the truth that's in the details, because you live your life in a truthful way. You can't not have been in this room. You can't say things that didn't take place. Your life is a combination of things which mount and amount and amount, and they are truthful, they are factual. So if you find a parenthesis in someone's life that you can't explain, you need to ferret it out and figure it out. So other than your family, we have education through junior high and high school and into college. Did you go to the same place your brother went because he went there, or did you blaze your own trail, or did you get scholarships? Why do you do what you do? What is, and the law they say, the mens rea, what is your motive behind the things you do? When we worked counterintelligence against embassy officials, we had 3 questions we would ask in order to learn more about their personalities. It was, what makes him laugh? What makes him cry? And does he love his wife? And those questions may seem small, but each one has a chapter worth of answer. But it tells you what makes him tick, and that's what we're looking for. Not just where you were and what you did, but the motive behind it. Is this a person that you want to give a security clearance to? Besides the categories of family and education, we have jobs, all the jobs you ever had, why you got them, why you went from one to the next. There's travel. Travel is very important. Did your family go to France? Did you go out to Giverny and see Monet's lily pad garden? Did you think that was majestic and wonderful, or did you think it was a swamp-infested, mosquito-ridden place? What were your thoughts? And then we have anomalies. I like anomalies. You broke your leg when you were in college, so badly skiing that you had to be in the hospital. You have a birth of a child. You have a death of a parent. What makes your highs and lows make you feel good and make you feel bad? So they initially called these interviews cradle to grave, but that really wasn't correct. A Chinese man came in one day, and he had an interesting story, but it's tough to get a clearance if you're coming from mainland China. And he said, no, his parents were in mainland China, the communist nation, and they were in the ferry boat coming across to Taiwan, and they met on that boat while they were escaping to freedom. That's a good background. That'll work. But also changed when the interview began. So if we go all through this procedure with the linear way, and you follow dates and months up on the wall, and you come down to a spot and punch a pin through it and say, well, at this point, your father had just changed jobs, your brother just started law school, your little sister started to go to college, your stay-at-home mom got her first job in 25 years, and you just started your junior year of college, but you were still in crutches because you had the broken leg from skiing. And they'll sit there and say, how do you know that? And the answer is because you told me, but I put it down in a linear way. So the moral of that part of the story is that for our interviews, they would take 3 hours, sometimes 2.5. People would lower the resistance a little bit and answer all of the questions. But essentially they started with, how did your parents meet? And the last question is, what did you have for breakfast? And it covers almost everything in between. The program spread far and wide around the government. In 2007, my oldest son, Thomas, was going to go from college right into the Marine Corps. His recruiting sergeant said, you need to come in for just one more thing, and Thomas asked what it was. And he said, you probably wouldn't understand, but it's something called a PSI. So if it hadn't been for an Afghan coming to get his job back to be a penetration by the Mujahideen of US intelligence, and a Polish exchange student in Poland who had been hoodwinked by Polish intelligence, these interviews may not have taken place. And I think our country's been more secure. It's been in a better situation. Overall, it's been 30 years that the PSI has been in season, and I'm very proud and honored to be considered the father of the PSI. And that's interviewing the FBI way.